Hey, sister students, I'm going to finish up Reagan and HW Bush. So let's start with Reagan foreign policy. So Reagan believed that America needed to be the world's defender of freedom and democracy, and we needed to have a strong military around the world and defending us at home. And so the Reagan doctrine comes into play, and the Reagan doctrine is going to be, we're not just going to contain communism, so no longer we're just containing, but we want to roll back communism and get rid of communism where it exists. We're going to aid anti-communist freedom fighters. We're going to aid them in places around the world like Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua, and Cambodia. And we're going to create peace around the world and at home through our strength. And so he believed that if we want to prevent war, we need to make our enemies believe that we are too powerful to be attacked, and so that they won't attack us. So we're going to build up the military. And he proposes what's called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. It's also known as Star Wars. So you can see it as Star Wars or SDI. Basically, it's going to defend us at home. It's going to be a system of satellites that are going to be able to shoot down nuclear missiles using lasers. And it's a huge initiative that the United States kind of took on for a while, spent a lot of money trying to develop it. But it's supposed to be this huge defense system where we couldn't be attacked by nuclear missiles. Here's Reagan giving updates about Star Wars and about the defense initiatives to the country. Here's kind of a mock-up or a drawing of the satellites that would shoot lasers down and blow up missiles before they reach the United States. Reagan also had to deal with terrorism during his time as president as part of his foreign policy. So terrorism, as you probably know, is using violence or threatening to use violence to gain a goal, a political or social achievement. In several instances that happened in Reagan's administration is going to be 1982. Israeli forces invaded Lebanon, setting off a civil war between Christians and Palestinian refugees living in the area. Now, Lebanon requested support, and Reagan sent in U.S. Marines to restore order. And then in 1983, there was a suicide bomber that attacked U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. So 241 Marines were killed in that attack. It was a terrorist attack. Shortly after that point, Reagan withdrew the Marines from Lebanon to get them out of harm's way. A big secret issue that Reagan dealt with, a problem, kind of a scandal that he dealt with during his time as president, was known as the Iran-Contra affair. So this is a secret foreign policy operation that officials in Reagan's administration did. Now, Reagan did not do this on his own, or really, we don't have any proof that he even knew about it. But here's kind of the background. Now, the U.S. has a policy that we don't negotiate or make deals with terrorists. That's been a U.S. policy for some time. But White House officials sold weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages in Lebanon. Now, profits of the sales of selling weapons to Iran, who supported global terrorism, so we're selling weapons to a country that supports terrorism, and we're going to send that money to anti-communist rebels that are called the Contra. This group's called the Contra. They're the Contra rebels. They're fighting in Nicaragua. Now, the reason why this is a scandal is because Congress had said that the United States is not going to aid the Contras. They said it's not our deal. We're not going to get involved in this. We're not going to help the Contras in Nicaragua. And so when Reagan's administration goes and sells weapons to a country that supports terrorists and then uses that money and ships it to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, it's going against what Congress has said. That's where the scandal comes in. So this was investigated. It came out that Reagan did not have any direct linkage to the scandal, but he failed to monitor his officials adequately. So there were several officials that were convicted of lying to Congress, lying, not flying, and they were jailed. And the Iran-Contra affair, it tarnished America's credibility in the world, and again leads to distrust in government, because if they're doing this, what else are they doing without the American public knowing? So as Reagan is leaving office in the end of the 80s, we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Cold War, if that makes sense. So the Soviet Union is starting to unravel a little bit. The leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, he becomes leader of the Soviet Union in 85. And the communist system in Russia was failing. And so Gorbachev puts reforms in place that give the people, the Soviets, more freedom and more choice. And a lot of historians would argue that Gorbachev's policies of giving the people freedom and choice led to the downfall. Others are going to credit Reagan and say that Reagan put pressure on the Soviets by building up the U.S. military with all of his defense spending, put pressure on the Soviets, caused their economy to collapse. And then, of course, you have those that say it's a little bit of both. Because going back to this, if you give the Soviets freedom and choice, and they've never really had that before, you give a person that's been deprived of freedom a little taste of freedom, they're going to want more. And that's what the people did. They demanded more and more freedoms, and it ultimately led to the downfall of the Communist Party and communism in the Soviet Union. Okay, so now we're going to get into George HW Bush. This was the election of 88, and he goes to 93. So H.W. Bush, he was Reagan's vice president for 2 terms. So he runs after Reagan's second term, so he runs in 88. And he promises to continue Reagan's policies, because people are generally happy with Reagan's policies. But he's going to promise greater compassion dealing with the homeless and the poor. He's going to improve education, and he's going to fight drug use. These are his main promises. But his biggest promise of all is he says we're going to have no new taxes. He even goes on in a speech, says, read my lips, no new taxes. And he promises the American people no new taxes. So once he becomes president, he wins the election of 88. His biggest challenge is the budget deficit. So America's going into debt. So he does get to cut some military spending because the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991. And so we're kind of out of the Cold War. We're not having to fight them. But in 1990, 2 years after becoming president, he agrees to increase income taxes on the wealthy, which that goes against one of his promises. And so that was pulled up, and it says that he lied because he promised no new taxes, and then he brought in new taxes. Okay, we look at defense spending and its impact on the economy. Now, when the United States government is spending lots of money on military and defense, the positive can be it can provide a short-term stimulus and can pull a country out of a recession. So, like getting into World War II, the defense spending and the military spending kind of jump-started the economy and pulled us out of the Great Depression. The negative is it can take money away from other things, and it can slow long-term economic growth. So when we think about Johnson, it's kind of covered up here, but it's talking about Johnson's Great Society. We talked about Johnson's Great Society, but it didn't really have the chance to succeed because of the defense spending and the military spending of Vietnam took money away from the Great Society programs. So there's positives and negatives of defense spending. All right, H.W. Bush at home. So he got to nominate Supreme Court justices. He chose 2 conservative justices, which that led to a conservative majority on the court. They toughened the rules on criminals. They reduced abortion rights. And here's the new ones. We've got Clarence Thomas and David Souter. All right, domestically at home, H.W. Bush is dealing with a recession. So the U.S. is gradually moving back into recession in 1990. Economists blame the recession on reduced spending, so people aren't spending as much. People aren't spending as much. Consumers, businesses, and governments aren't spending as much. Where there's less spending because the Cold War is over. Foreign competition is reducing demand for American products. People are buying less American products. And this is proof because the jobs that were once in the Northeast, manufacturing industry centers, they're going away. People are losing jobs, and businesses are moving south, and they're moving west. They're moving from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. H.W. Bush did have a huge win for Americans with disabilities. He signs the ADA, Americans with Disability Act, in 1990, which this prohibited discrimination against people that have disabilities. So you can't not get a job because you're disabled, and you have to be publicly accommodated. So wheelchair ramps, handicap spots, all that kind of stuff. Hotels, restaurants, theaters, all these places have to install accessible areas for wheelchairs and the handicapped and disabled. And employers have to make accommodations for their workers whenever they can to try to help disabled Americans work when they can and where they can. All right, Bush foreign policy. Now, one of Bush's domestic policies was to cut down on drugs, fight drugs, war on drugs, all that. And that leads into foreign policy because in Panama, the dictator there was a well-known drug dealer, and those drugs were entering the United States from Panama. And so what happened was there was an election in Panama. Noriega's party, Manuel Noriega, the dictator and the drug dealer, his party lost the election, but he refused to give up control. He took control of the country, and so this gave the United States an opportunity to jump in. They captured Noriega. They brought him to the United States to face drug charges. He was convicted of drug charges in the United States, and the government of Panama was restored to the democratically elected leader that the people of Panama had chosen. This is called Operation Just Cause, and it's 1989 to 1990. H.W. Bush also saw the end of the Cold War. So Gorbachev's policies, Reagan's policies, historians say different things, but whatever the cause was, the Soviet Union collapsed. 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down, which reunited Germany. Eastern European countries became democratic, and then the Soviet Union finally collapsed completely in 1991 and formed 15 new countries. And so on the map down here, you can see the 15 new countries. Russia being the biggest right here, and then all around it, a bunch of different countries were created out of the Soviet Union. Here's the Berlin Wall coming down. And then we have more Bush foreign policy, the Gulf War, 1990. So the Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein, he invaded Kuwait. Kuwait was a neighbor of Iraq. Kuwait had large oil reserves, and Saddam Hussein wanted to capture those oil reserves, so he invaded Kuwait. Now, the UN told him to withdraw, but Hussein refused to leave Kuwait, and so the U.S. led UN forces and attacked Iraq and pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait. February 1991, Hussein agrees to pull all of Iraqi troops out of Kuwait and to repay Kuwait for the damages caused, and so this was a victory for the United States and the UN by being able to push Iraq out of Kuwait, restore Kuwait back to its elected leaders.